Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Critical Reasoning. In this lecture video, we are going to talk about the second kind of conformity called group polarization. So, group polarization, the very most basic definition of it that you read about, occurs when members of a deliberating group typically end up in a more extreme position that's in line with their tendencies, so what they had in mind going in before deliberation began. So if you recall, the basic idea of conformity is just these different ways in which we do as others do, right? And we talked about when it comes to social cascades, this is something we see like a lot on social media, where just because a bunch of people are saying it's true or we should do it, we don't really think, we just go along with the crowd. So this is a different kind of conformity. This kind of conformity most notably involves deliberation. So by deliberation, I mean conversations with other people, and that can happen in a huge variety of formats, right? That happens during our exchanges with people on social media. That happens in conversations with friends and family members in person. Deliberation is something that happens in a classroom. It can happen between people serving on a jury. It's just talking about what we think, specifically what we think about a particular issue. And it's through these different kinds of discussions in all modes and formats that we will do as others do, in the sense that through these conversations, we end up holding more extreme positions of the position that we originally held before we started those conversations. So one thing to just bear in mind right off the bat is as I'm talking about examples and I'm going through what this concept is, you're going to be reminded quite a bit of cascades, in the sense that there are definitely informational and reputational factors that are involved here. So to give you an example, I think when we are talking with people about maybe a specific instance of something that's getting pegged as like cancel culture on it, like somebody's getting called out on the internet, right? And you have people who are on one side, on one side of like, yes, I think this person should be canceled. And then you have people that are on other side of the debate saying, no, I do not think this person should be canceled, right? And I think something that all of us are somewhat aware of, no matter how wrapped up we've gotten in these kinds of conversations, is that when we talk to like-minded people, people that we have maybe some kind of identity affiliation with, like somebody, like somebody who's like also a student or grew up in your neighborhood, is a member of your religion or something like this, right? And so we're going in, we identify with the people that we're having these conversations with. We like see some of ourselves in them, right? And we start talking about, why we think it's, say this person, this bad actor, did something wrong. Or on the flip side, you have people on the other side, right? Maybe identifying with some group of people that they're talking to, and they're really thinking that there's an overreaction, that this person, this like supposed bad actor, didn't actually do wrong, and the punishment is far too harsh, right? And I think that we're all roughly familiar with this sense of like, which side of the debate, no matter which side of the debate that people fall on, through these conversations, oftentimes there's this phenomena where we get more extreme in our views. Like we feel more passionately about our position than we did before we started talking to other people. So I think, or rather, I think another place that that probably a lot of you can identify with this is either talking about like a teacher or an instructor, high school, college, whatever, or like maybe a manager or a boss you've had at a job, talking to fellow students or talking to fellow coworkers, right, about why you perhaps don't like this person. And it's worth taking a minute to just even, you could pause the video and think about a time where you had one of those conversations with people where it's like you thought the way that the instructor was grading papers or something like this, or how they lectured, like you thought it was like really unfair. Like say they were talking about a bunch of things during the lectures, and none of those things were topics that got covered in exams. So like when you went into the exam, you felt like you had no idea what was going on. You have no idea where the professor was getting that stuff from, right? And you talk to your fellow students and you're thinking, hey, this is really messed up. And then you start to give examples. Now, if this is an instance that resonates with you, right, I think that it's really worth considering, how did you feel maybe more strongly after having the conversation, giving all these examples, hearing other people's experiences and thoughts on why this professor or instructor was really unfair? Did you feel more strongly in your negative feelings towards that professor after the conversation than you did prior to the conversation? Now, if you've never had an experience like that, maybe try to think of an instance that's like similar at a job, perhaps. Or even like discussing with like a sibling or another family member, like how somebody who took care of you, like a parent or something like this, was like too hard on you and being unfair, right? Just one of these conversations where, essentially we're complaining about something to another sympathetic person or several other sympathetic people. And we all start laying out the reasons why we have a right to complain, why there's this person who's doing something wrong and unfair to us. And the more we have those conversations, just those kind of like negative feelings, those strong feelings really build up. Those kinds of instances, that kind of phenomena, we might think like, hey, we went in, we had our own independent ideas, I wasn't doing as others do. But that group amping up in their sort of like frustration with the other person, like the teacher or the boss or whatever, everybody's doing, we see some conforming effects there. And it's something that happens very naturally, right? And in a lot of ways, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It really is, it's far more of a neutral thing if we really think about it, right? Because it's understandable in those kinds of conversations that we become more polarized, because we might, for instance, be getting more evidence that this person who we think is doing something messed up has been doing more things that are messed up. For instance, if you talk to several other people who feel like their grade's been affected because this like professor or instructor is not covering the material that you're like getting tested on these exams, if you're hearing these other stories about people, their grades are suffering like your own because you have somebody who's not doing things correctly, you have more evidence they're not doing things correctly, and you might feel more strongly that this is not a good, not a good teacher. This is not someone that you like, right? It makes a lot of sense. And it especially makes sense when we're talking about these things with like-minded people, right? Like the more we trust them, we see some of ourselves in them, and they're giving us evidence that confirms a belief we already had before going into the conversation. And that understandably may really increase our confidence in our position on things, like this person's not a good boss, this person's not a good teacher, something like this. And like I was talking about with Cascade, sometimes that's a good thing when the group gets it right. Maybe everybody through this deliberation sort of comes together and requests that the instructor provides better study materials for exams and quizzes, right? Like you come up with like a really good solution. You get confident to the point where like you even approach that professor, that instructor, the teacher from high school, whatever, and say, hey, we would really appreciate some extra study materials here, right? Like you're confident enough in your position, something positive comes out. Really was no way that people could know what was going to be on these exams, right? And everybody ended up getting a better education, a better understanding of the material as a result. So it can be a good thing. Definitely, most certainly. But like we're going to talk about, it can also be a really bad thing. So some downsides of group polarization that we really want to keep in mind. There are two primary ways that it can undermine the critical reasoning process. So it can cause people to believe things that aren't necessarily true, right? I think just to sort of go back to the example where you're talking with some classmates about some frustrations that you're having with the teacher. Um, you know, there are, it's not difficult to imagine a slightly different situation where you have an instructor who is making these materials available, has talked to explain to students about how to find them, things like this. And people forget, or they don't know maybe how to engage with like something like maybe the instructor put them on Blackboard, but and explained where to find them, but people forgot where to find them and things like this. So people are getting really frustrated, talking to one another, being like, yeah, this stuff isn't available, like she doesn't explain this stuff, where to find it or whatever. And here we are going into these exams and we have absolutely no idea, what's on them, when in reality earlier on in the term the instructor had explained where to find those things and how to deal with any confusion about the material that's being covered in the exam. But through group deliberation, all that stuff, all those explanations, all those instructions fell by the wayside, and people are just focusing on, no, there's none of these things are available. We're just going into these exams blind, and this is so unfair. This isn't what's being talked about in the lectures, etc., and etc. So through those kinds of deliberation, people really just form these strong opinions like, no, there's absolutely no way for me to do well on these exams. The instructor's not giving me the information I need, right? When in reality, maybe it wasn't the easiest thing to find, but that stuff was available. People came to form sort of false beliefs or things that aren't true about really useful information that if they kind of kept that in mind, they wouldn't have had all of these really extreme frustrations with the professor, and perhaps would have found some of the materials that would have helped them do better on these exams and things like this. So in that instance, right, we have a group of people that are believing a certain conclusion of an argument, right, based on bad facts that aren't true, right? They have bad evidence. There is, to put it in a way that hopefully rings familiar for some of you, at least, right? Some of the premises in the argument are false. Therefore, that gives us reason, right? If we're doing a good job scrutinizing the evidence and that sort of thing, right? We would realize that the conclusion of the argument is based on false facts. Therefore, it's not the kind of argument that we should believe. The conclusion of the argument, we should say, no, this is based on some false facts. Another way that critical reasoning can undermine the critical reasoning, or sorry, another way that group polarization can undermine the critical reasoning process is essentially by people not realizing the morally bad consequences of what they're arguing for. So this is especially relevant to instances of group polarization that involve, say, like moral judgments, right, about a certain kind of behavior that is or isn't okay. And something that can often happen, for instance, the cancel culture example that I mentioned earlier, or the canceling example that I mentioned earlier. You might be wanting to say, you can have two groups. I'm going to try to keep this as abstract as possible, so not to trigger any memories of a specific instance where this happened. So, if you want to bear something specific in mind, that's fine, but just try to remain as try to resist perhaps some of the group polarizing effects that have already sort of happened to you with bearing that example in mind. Hopefully that makes sense. So if we take an instance of someone who is, say, getting there's a bunch of public attention being paid to something bad that a single person has done. I mean, I think that we have a lot of examples of that, like really like toxic, abusive, like bully type bosses and or people that sexually harass employees, right? So if we want to just think really quickly about, people who support those kinds of figures, ones that say, what they did wasn't that bad, or people are exaggerating, they're lying, they're like too soft, all of these sorts of things. I think this is something that is, really important when we're talking about things involving like sexual violence and abuse, where people want to come out in support of someone who's been accused of these things and say, well, the person just wanted attention, they're lying, this sort of thing, right? And what oftentimes people fail to consider is that, in essence, the form of those kinds of arguments are pretty bad because, first and foremost, we don't have an especially effective system for helping to protect people who have been victims of those sorts of crimes. So more specifically, the way that providing evidence in court works, right? One thing that like people who are survivors of like sexual violence and abuse are often told is like, oh, well, your story has changed, so and so's story has changed. They can't keep the facts straight, right? And under those circumstances, or rather, when someone has experienced a traumatic event, and this isn't just exclusive to like sexual abuse or violence, like this could be like getting in a car accident, this could be some other kind of like violence or something like this, like, but any kind of trauma, those experiences of trauma psychologically were really bad, not just at oftentimes what it is we're really bad at maintaining sort of a consistent story as to specifically the details of what happened, and this is a very well documented phenomena. So when someone comes forward saying, I was sexually assaulted, and they tell what happened to them the first time around, it's very, very common for the second or third time around for some slight detail to change, because that's just how trauma affects the human psyche. And again, this is something we do have really well documented evidence for. So in court, though, when that happens, right, that person's pegged as, oh, look, like they're lying, they can't keep their facts straight. And then and it's not hard to imagine. I think we've seen this happen on a lot of online forums and social media and things like this, where people who are on the side of the perpetrator point to things like, oh, look, they changed this detail of the story. They said that they were doing this thing when actually we can see that they were doing that thing. Or they use this kind of makeup to like cover up a bruise on their face, but that makeup, that company hadn't even made that series yet, so that's impossible, they were lying. And you can see people during deliberation online, like on social media, whatever, talking about this person and really like focusing on that evidence, amping up, getting more confident, really strongly going, hey, like this person's innocent, that other person was lying, right? Under circumstances like those, we don't see the bad consequences, morally bad consequences of what we're arguing for. For instance, that's not how somebody changing their story because they've experienced a trauma is actually a perfectly normal thing. That's not the kind of evidence we need to prove someone is lying. or something along those lines. So there can be like some pretty, and if we want to hold people to those standards, what we're going to end up doing is overall just making it extremely difficult for people who have been, subject to any kind of violence, like sexual or not, to come forward, especially when those experiences are really terrible, traumatic experiences. So another thing to keep in mind about the ways that group polarization can undermine the critical reasoning process is, bad facts and not the kind of evidence we need to believe the conclusion of an argument. Those two things can definitely overlap during the course of group deliberation. So when those two things overlap, we get like extra bad downsides of group polarization. So in those instances, we have people becoming more polarized and developing even more extreme harmful beliefs, in part because they fail to consider relevant evidence for supporting what they're talking about, and they fail to examine whether or not certain facts they're taking to be true are in fact actually true. So we see sort of like this dovetailing of both of the ways that the critical reasoning process can fail, really getting amped up or juiced up by these group deliberating effects, by these group polarizing effects during group deliberation. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, rather, now what I'm going to talk about are factors that increase group polarization. You can also think of them as different things that cause group polarization. So these three different factors, which were discussed in the reading, are informational bias, corroboration, confidence, and extremism. And I'll explain how all three of those things connect in just a moment. And then social comparison. So I'm going to explain each of these three factors in detail. However, bear in mind that it's very common for these different things to overlap and get kind of entangled with each other. Sometimes informational bias, for instance, might cause or increase group polarization on its own, or sometimes it might work in tandem with something like social comparison. So just bear that in mind as I'm discussing each one of these factors individually. So it doesn't have to be a single cause, essentially. There can be multiple causes of group polarization. So the first factor, the first cause or influencer of group polarization we're going to talk about is informational bias. So this is a concept that all of us, I think, are probably pretty familiar with. Oftentimes within psychology and other fields, it gets referred to as confirmation bias. Individually, what happens oftentimes with various things that we believe, right, is that we look for evidence that confirms our view. We seek out the evidence, the facts that support what we believe rather than consider evidence against us. Okay. And as a result, when we do this, or rather not as a result, but when we do this in conversation with other like-minded people about certain subjects, you have a group of people that is presenting evidence that confirms other people's beliefs, right? And like I talked about a little bit ago, getting more evidence, boosting our opinions, boosting our confidence, right? That can lead to us developing further, stronger beliefs about something, as in more extreme beliefs about a thing before, or rather stronger beliefs about a particular subject or an issue or debate, right? Than we had prior to coming into this conversation, where other people were dishing out evidence that also confirms all of our views. So consequently, what happens under those kinds of circumstances is that a group, right, ends up with more evidence that confirms what they already thought. So I'm going to return, or I'm going to discuss the resume study again in just a minute. This is something that got brought up a couple of times in the reading. But one example of informational bias that was discussed there was this study that was done on sort of a resume evaluation. So what happened in the study was they got a group of people where they essentially took, I think in the first study it was like three different resumes, and they sort of spliced up the information on took away the person's name and spliced up like the information or cut up like the information, different bits, portions of the resume, and then handed those different portions of the resume. So maybe like there's like the background or like education portion of the essay or the resume. There's experience. There are maybe like a portion where there was like some kind of like recommendation, things like this. They cut all that stuff up and they handed it out to like, say, I don't know, like 10 different people in this group. And they did this with three separate resumes. So you get like background information. It would be resume number one. And then you would get and then you would get recommendations or like references, the references portion for resume number two. And so if we piece these all back together, everyone in the group would be able to put back each one of these, like they would have the complete resume. The basic idea here is everybody only had a little bit of evidence about each one of these candidates. Okay. And what the researchers very quickly found is that as soon as there was a sort of like propensity or positive feeling or positive sentiment expressed for, say, like resume or candidate number one, then what they found was that people started so if it was like, oh, well, I think that, based off of this person's work experience, right, I think that they would be like really good for this job, right? And then if someone else had say the reference section, like the person's references, if they had that portion of the resume, and those references corroborated or supported, it was evidence that supported this, like, yeah, that would be a really good candidate, they would share that information. Now, if they had a list of people who are references that didn't seem totally relevant to that work experience, right, then they would hide it. Okay. So what they were seeing essentially in these studies is that as soon as there was a sort of some positive sentiment expressed towards one candidate, other people in the group, and this is where we see this group polarizing effect, other people in the group, after talking about it, listening to other people's reasons, right, and starting to like agree that, yeah, like say like candidate number one, like that sounds like a really good one. If they had evidence from that person, candidate number one's resume, that they were a good candidate, they would share it with the group. And if the evidence didn't really support it, they wouldn't share it with the group. So we really see that sort of confirmation bias happening in action, sharing the information that supports the group consensus that candidate number one is the right choice for the job, and then hiding the evidence that suggests maybe candidate number one is not the right choice for the job. So that tendency to focus on the information that confirms something we believe and then sort of hide or push out of our minds the evidence that disconfirms or disproves what we believe, that bias is one that can definitely, sometimes on its own or in combination with other factors, give rise to this conforming effect of group polarization, where everybody goes in thinking maybe, or not everybody, but most people go in thinking like, okay, or one, we'll imagine one person going in. I think candidate number one is probably the right choice. But then by the end of deliberation, with all that confirming evidence, right, talking with the rest of the group, they walk out and they go, oh my gosh, we absolutely have to hire candidate number one. They are incredible. They're amazing, right? A far more extreme belief that they had before having that conversation with everyone else in the group. Okay, so the next factor or cause that can increase or cause group polarization is what Sunstein, the person that wrote the reading on this subject, refers to as corroboration, confidence, and extremism. So this factor, this sort of like, it's like, so corroboration of evidence leads to confidence, and that confidence can lead to extremism. Just sort of like on a psychological level, what happens to us during this process. And this is definitely something that we saw in the resume example that I talked about just a second ago. So the idea here is that corroboration, when others give us more evidence that supports the things we already believe, right? That informational bias, that strengthens our confidence. It gives us more evidence to think that our original position was true. And as a result, we develop a more extreme, like hardened opinion on something that we already believed going into the conversation. So another way to put it is confidence increases with more evidence given to us by other people, right? And that supports the group's initial opinion. If we all think that this professor's, teaching approach is really messed up, and we don't have any access, like there's no way for us to know these things that keep coming up on quizzes and exams, right? And like, the more we talk about that, the more we discuss our evidence for that, the more corroboration we get, the more confidence we get in that opinion that what the teacher is doing, what the instructor or professor is doing is messed up, right? And the more extreme we feel about that level of messed up, right? So this is perhaps something that, you can imagine a variation of the resume study where something like this occurs. But this is something that I think we really see this kind of this way that things just work in our minds oftentimes during these group deliberations with like-minded people who kind of already agree with us. This is something that definitely happens a lot when we're talking about, I think things that frustrate us, upset us, like negative feeling type things, right? And they can really also amp up our feelings about how angry we feel towards another person. If there's a particular celebrity you already think is kind of annoying, you go online and like there's some kind of, they come up, they're in the headline for some reason, a bunch of people you follow, like-minded people, maybe having a conversation about how obnoxious that particular celebrity is, right? They give you more evidence, more instances, more examples of that celebrity being so annoying and dumb. And it makes sense that you walk away feeling more extreme. Like maybe you were like, yeah, that person kind of sucks. And by the end of the time you're done scrolling or whatever, you walk away feeling like extremely angry. Like if you saw that person on the street, maybe you would want to like spit in their face or something like this, right? Maybe, hopefully not that extreme. But I think you see where I'm going. I think that a lot of us can recall, maybe not something with a celebrity and being online, but just even conversations about particular people we don't like or something like this. Having conversations with people who are also kind of don't like that person. Those people giving us evidence that corroborates this idea that that person kind of sucks. Us feeling more confident in the sense like, yeah, that person kind of sucks. And then feeling like that person sucks even more than you did before talking trash about that person with other people, right? So this is an influence factor that can really increase this development of more extreme beliefs, falling in line with other people, this particular kind of conforming behavior where, having conversations makes us develop these stronger negative beliefs. Okay, so the last factor or cause that I'm going to talk about that increases group polarization is this thing that Sunstein refers to as social comparison. So, social comparison happens when we develop opinions in part because we want to be seen a certain way. We want to have these certain kind of opinions by we want there's like certain other people we want to see us as the kind of person that would believe these sorts of things. So I think that, sort of like a modern day example of that is when people are like, they sort of state their different political affiliations. Where, if I vote this way, I'm registered to vote this way, like I want other people to see that I believe all of these all of these other things. I think another place we definitely still see it today, but something that I think an example that probably um at least some of you have already thought of already, but if you recall, like the Salem witch trials, right? So, and this wasn't just exclusive to Salem. There was like certain very extremist, like puritanical sort of ideas about the way people should be acting in things like this, right? And as soon as there was someone, most often a woman in a community, that sort of acted in a way that they felt that they didn't like, right? That was regarded as evidence that that person was a witch. Okay. And I think this is a really, again, this is like this is like not a modern day example, but I think that the Salem witch trials really captures the way in which social comparison can like significantly drive group polarization, this sort of conforming behavior that we see. So, you might like you can imagine a situation where there is like some person in a community that um maybe is doing things in a way that people see as kind of weird, something like this, something that perhaps like goes against like these certain like religious norms within this community, right? And like that sort of that very specific version of Christianity, like they weren't coming off as like the right kind of Christian, like in this community. And it's not hard to imagine, neighbors of that person like wanting to call them out and being like, oh, look at, their look at how like she addresses her husband or something like this, right? Or like the way that she's taking care of her kids or something like this. Like there's like these judgments that get formed, and people want to call that out. They want to say, hey, signal to other members of the community, like, look at me, I am such a good, like I am the picture of the good, like the good Christian. I'm so good at it, I can point out the other ways that this person is falling short. See me, right? This is rather this opinion I have, these criticisms I have of this person who's behaving in this like quote unquote unchristian kind of way. Again, this is a very specific kind of Christianity. We're talking about Salem witch trial era. So they want to be seen as the kind of person who sees that kind of bad behavior and thinks that kind of behavior is very like is offensive and wrong, and like really puts that on blast and is telling people in the community, I saw her doing this, I saw her doing that. See, I'm the kind of person with the kind of person that has these kinds of opinions, that notices these kinds of things, is like the upstanding like Christian citizen in this community, right? And so that person's coming forward, talking trash about their neighbor, saying like why they're weird and bad. And they start talking to other people, and those other people are like, well, I want to be seen. I mean, of course it doesn't happen this explicitly, maybe it did for some people, but they like there's that pressure that I want to be seen as a person who also thinks that kind of bad in that's who also thinks that that's bad unchristian behavior, right? And they're talking, so then maybe they share some more evidence, right? And then you got some corroboration, people start feeling more confident, like that neighbor is a bad neighbor. Oh, she is so bad. Oh, she's so bad. she's a witch, right? We really can imagine in this example how you what might start as like, I want people to see I'm the kind of person that thinks that behavior isn't okay, ends up showing up in conversations where, that see how not okay here's this evidence for how not okay this person is. And then getting more evidence confirming that belief, the next thing they know, they're calling to end that person's life, right? Like it's a really very extreme example, not something that I'm trying to connect in any way, shape, or form with like day-to-day life now, but this is the sort of conforming effect we see happening in instances of group polarization. These are kind of like the steps that leads up to it, and one of those causes can be this phenomena of social comparison. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. So like I mentioned in the resume study, um, one or yeah, one example that served as one example of group polarization. And it's not difficult to imagine. And there also were different iterations of that resume study that occurred where people actually didn't like, maybe they didn't like candidate number one that much, but they didn't want to be perceived as a person who would have bad opinions, right? And so they withheld important information. So they didn't necessarily or rather they they didn't go into the conversation, this deliberation, this deliberative process, having a really strong or having any kind of like tendency towards, say, candidate number one. But they did feel enough of that pressure from that social comparison bit to withhold information, and were exposed to other people that were giving further information that confirmed candidate number one was the right choice. So what we see in this example, right, is somebody shifting their position a little bit, going along with the direction the group, but maybe not developing like a strong like for candidate number one, but not going in the opposite direction. And in doing so, they withheld negative information about that candidate. Another example of group polarization occurs in the face of this thing that Sunstein refers to as deliberation, that where one side of the debate has the rhetorical advantage. So one place that we see this popping up a lot are in punishment judgments, so jury deliberations. And what we see in those cases are prevailing social norms that can significantly shift individual judgments. So if you're in a place where there is a very strong emphasis on say like corporations seeing having to pay like significant punitive damages for wrongdoing on their end, like if there are a lot of norms around and focus on like how that's really messed up, if a corporation sells some defective product that causes harm and they're on trial for doing this sort of thing, with this norm surrounding these really intense punitive judgments, you're going to see juries during the deliberative process really wanting to significantly increase those punitive damages. They're really going to go. So if you have like a moral sort of like a morally loaded norm in place, there's just like some certain standards, like that's considered to be like really bad behavior, like littering is considered, like people are really like littering is so bad in a particular place, right? Obviously like not necessarily where we are, but like or recycling is another really good example. Like you can imagine places where like people, or I'm sure everyone here has like seen a person who's like, oh, if you don't recycle this thing, that's, you're destroying the environment and that's so bad, blah, 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 blah. So we can imagine a community of like-minded people like that, right? Where they might seek, pretty severe punitive damages to people who don't recycle. So essentially, like, if you have the norms, certain moral principles and norms of a particular area, like on your side, then that really can significantly boost like the deliberative or the group polarization that can occur during the deliberative process. So yeah, this is, and there's like different forms that this can take when it comes to punishment judgments that juries make. It could come in the form of, either significantly increasing like the payout that the people who are harmed by a crime get, right? I think that's a little less common in the United States. Something that is far more common, though, more intense punitive damages, is like really extreme forms of punishment. Like, people essentially, if you have the rhetorical advantage, if those moral norms are like on your side, right, it's going to be a lot easier to convince a group of people that are kind of like-minded as you that somebody who did something wrong deserves a more extreme punishment. So that can also function as an example. That's also an example of group polarization. Okay, so lastly, I am just going to discuss things that can increase or decrease group polarization. So we've covered a lot of this stuff already. A lot of this lecture video should feel like we're covering different concepts and kind of weaving back and forth in between one another. So if you're feeling a little bit dizzy, that's good. So influences that increase group polarization. So like-minded people. Again, if you are seeing a little bit of yourself in the people that you're arguing with, you feel like they're kind of in your boat, or you care about what they think of you, right? You're going to be, it's much easier to go on that path of, oh, I have the corroborating evidence. I feel more confident in my view. Now my belief is more extreme. Another thing that can really increase group polarizations here, that's very similar to stuff that we saw with cascades, is the presence of a confident person. So just kind of like being in the presence of someone who is very confidently believing and saying things that you kind of already thought were true, right? That'll boost your confidence also, right? That corroborating evidence will be an even more significant boost to your confidence. And then that can also lead to holding a more extreme belief, right? And that can have that effect can occur like within a group of people during the process of deliberation. And then another influence that can increase group polarization is having that shared sense of identity. So this is something that we see especially in the face of us versus them debates. So if we see, okay, yeah, well, us on this side, we can really see how it is, right? Versus them, they just like have their heads up their butt or whatever, right? That's going to be another instance where like they're so wrong, we're so right. That sort of amp up can occur in two different sides of a debate that are deliberating, talking about the other side of the debate, and just that knowing there's like that them, that not us out there that's opposing the group can also lead to that development of that other group, right, forming stronger, more extreme beliefs. Lastly, and I think this is a really good one, a really, really good one to think about, especially considering, we're doing these discussion board assignments, right? We're going to be talking a lot in there, or yeah, we will be talking a lot in there about group polarization. You're going to be talking about group polarization a lot on your module 3 worksheet, right? So in thinking about all of these examples, especially examples of ones where the critical reasoning process is significantly undermined, we want to also think about influences, things that can decrease group polarization. So, like cascades, someone who's in the in group can take a stand, say, like, no, I don't actually think this is right. Are we sure this is how we want to evaluate people who are coming forward and giving statements on their experiences of sexual abuse and violence, right? Like, if you have someone who is in the in group that was maybe initially sensitive or identifies with the rest of the group in some kind of way, standing up and saying, like, no, I don't think that we're doing the other side justice here, right? Like, we're missing something important about their argument. When somebody takes a stand, someone who's in the group recognizes, like, oh, but you are one of us, that can have a really significant effect on whether or not group polarization occurs. Another kind of, so not even just taking a stand, but or not only taking a stand, but offering more information, right? So resisting, maybe like what we were talking about with the hidden profiles in the example of the resume study, offering more information that perhaps was getting missed, relevant information that was perhaps getting missed during these conversations, can also stop people from developing more extreme beliefs. Okay, so that about does it for our lecture on group polarization. I really encourage everybody to think a lot more about the ways in which we can sort of try to mitigate or push back against the strong effects of group polarization. I would also just like to remind everyone, because we are going to be talking about some polarizing topics now, and you're going to be thinking about those, talking about those in your discussion board posts, that it's really important, because we're probably going to be, a lot of these examples, things that we give, they're things that we care about, right? There's something that, there's a lot of potential for us to be talking about things that are polarizing subjects, and there's going to be people in those conversations that have become polarized on those subjects too. So I think I want to reiterate, and everybody's been doing a really great job with this, but I just want to reiterate that in light of these different subjects that may come up, just to be really mindful about how you are speaking with fellow classmates. And this definitely goes for the group chat as well. And in the event that anything comes up that you feel uncomfortable about, disrespected any kind of way, I just would also like to remind everyone that I'm here. If you need me to intervene, or if you just want to express your discomfort, any way I can offer that kind of support, I'm here. All right, so that does it for this lecture. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you next time.